In this presentation, I will compare the ontological foundations of modern economics and Islam, and I do this in response to the effort and attempt by Muslim economists to craft for themselves a new discipline of economics based on Islamic values, what they call Islamic economics. And this will demonstrate why the Islamic economists have not been successful in crafting a new discipline for themselves, because they have not considered the ontological differences between modern economics and Islam to appreciate why they cannot construct a discipline of Islamic economics on the foundations of modern economics. But economics, as we currently understand it, is a creature and developed as a discipline after the establishment of modern science itself. And therefore, to understand the ontology of economics, we have to first understand the relationship between ontology and science. And to guide us through this nexus of relationship between economics, science, and ontology, I will first review some of the assumptions of modern economics, look at some of the basic concepts that we need to be familiar with to understand these relationships, and I will thereafter look at or examine the foundations of modern science. In other words, I'll briefly look at the history of how modern science arose, who are some of the key contributors towards it, how does it conceive of reality and existence, and what implications this has had for our study of nature and reality. I'll lastly look at Islam. What are some of its basic tenets? How does it view life in reality? And what implications it has for the development of Islamic economics. Modern economic theory is developed on the basis of certain assumptions that are made about human beings, about the world that they live in and the resources that they use, about the kind of knowledge that they have, about the institutions within which they operate, and about the nature of the relationship between ethics and economics. So it begins by assuming that individuals are the basic unit of analysis, that the wants and needs of human beings are unlimited, but the resources that are used to satisfy their needs and wants are scarce, that human beings are self-interested, that they are directed only by the impulse of satisfying their own utility, and therefore that they are utility maximizers, and as producers they aim to maximize their profits. It makes the assumption that as consumers and as producers they possess complete knowledge in decision making, that they operate in markets which tends towards stability and equilibrium, and lastly it has excluded ethical and value considerations from economics as a science. These assumptions together establish what we may call the framework for inquiry and the study of the subject matter. But the framework itself is based on a foundation which consists of a set of presuppositions about three key aspects: about reality and existence, about the nature of knowledge, and about ethical and value considerations. So, for example, with respect to reality and existence, we may ask, what is the source of reality? How did it all begin? And what is its end like? What is the nature and composition or the characteristics of this reality that we would like to study and examine? So, for example, we may ask about human beings, about the world, about nature, and about the universe. And all of this has to do with the issue of ontology. Then, with respect to knowledge, we may ask, what are the sources of knowledge? How do we acquire knowledge? How do we transmit the knowledge? How permanent is the knowledge that we have? And this pertains to the area of epistemology. And lastly, we may consider both of these aspects in relation to ethical and value considerations, and what implications and impact or relationships might they have with these issues. And this is considered under axiology. And thus we find Therefore, any framework of inquiry, any scientific exploration invariably involves assumptions at the ontological, epistemological, and axiological levels. And so together, the framework and the foundation upon which it rests interact and integrate to form what is known as a paradigm. A paradigm therefore enables scientific analysis to occur in that it provides a lens through which the researcher or the scientist studies or explores his field of inquiry, and without which, as Einstein intimated, science will be primitive and muddled. We therefore find that a paradigm is indispensable for scientific exploration, in that it provides a basis for the scientist to begin and explore his field of study. In this graphic, I demonstrate what I call a relational framework of knowledge, in which I show how the areas of epistemology, ontology, and axiology all interact and integrate with one another to form the foundation upon which scientific exploration proceeds and begins. And based on that, the methodology that's used to discover the world is then established, which then also provides the basis for the disciplines of the scientific enterprises to then emerge. And thus economics, as a modern discipline, is predicated upon the foundations of modern science and the methodology that modern science uses to discover the world. It is against this background that we can now move on to understanding the emergence of modern science and the circumstances which led to its birth. If we study the history of the Western world, we will find that prior to the 14th century, the Christian church and the religious authorities had to a large extent shaped people's understanding of their existence and their purpose on this world. From the beginning of the 15th century until the 17th and 18th centuries, there were three key events that took place almost simultaneously. That is the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution, which coalesced and ushered in a fundamental shift in the way in which people understood the world around them. This period is called the modern period, in which the episteme of rationalism, in other words, that man began to gain self-confidence in his ability through the process of rationality to arrive at objective knowledge. And it was against this framework that modern science emerged. It is also important to note that during this period, man thought that he had the ability and the tools to arrive at objective knowledge and fundamental truths, independent of any kind of revelation. Nonetheless, from the middle of the last century, as a result of certain discoveries within modern physics, certain scientists and philosophers have been inveighing that we have now moved on from the modern period into what they call the postmodern period, in which knowledge is claimed to have been socially constructed, and even the values and ethical considerations that we hold dear are all relativized. It is therefore argued that modern man, or rather humanity, has moved from the medieval period to the modern period and now transited to the most postmodern period. But for all purposes, we will focus on the modern period because it was within this era that modern science, as we currently understand it, had emerged and established itself. We thus find that after the 15th century and during the 16th and early 17th centuries, we had certain key scientists and famous philosophers who contributed in important ways in setting the foundations of modern science. So we have, for example, Francis Bacon, who's credited in the West for having founded the modern scientific method. We have Galileo Galilei, who is quite famous for his altercations with the church authorities. We have René Descartes, who is a famous French mathematician, whom in fact is called the founder of modern science. And then we have others such as Johannes Kepler and the famous Isaac Newton. And these philosophers come scientists had indeed made certain important contributions towards how we should view the modern world. And what is this contribution, and what was the conception that they provided to us? The view of the world that they presented and of reality is that the entire universe is constituted or resembles a machine. In fact, they liken it to a clock which can be broken down into its individual parts. And because the universe functions as a machine, and because it is constituted of individual parts, it is therefore accurately predictable. They further argued that all of reality is constituted only of inert or dead matter and should therefore be explained only in terms of materiality. In other words, there were no forces that were beyond human perception that operated within the world of existence. Lastly, they asserted that all of nature can be expressed mathematically and is discoverable through observation. This physicalist or materialist conception of the world thus forms the ontological framework of modern science and gives birth to four key ideas. The first one is that of mechanism, in other words, that everything operates mechanically, and therefore it can be broken down into its individual parts, it can be atomized, and because it can be broken down into its individual parts, it is therefore deterministic, in which we can predict how it's going to function. And the last element is that the key feature of this materialist reality is that of its quantitative characteristics, and thus leading to the fourth element of quantification. And if you study modern science carefully and all of its disciplines, you will find that it's built up on the foundations of these four key elements of mechanism, atomism, determinism, and quantification. If you study almost all of the different disciplines, you will find that they incorporate one or more of these elements into their framework. And it is these elements which together interact and integrate and has formed the bedrock upon which modern science has been established. As Toffler in his 1995 publication recounts, they pictured a world in which every event was determined by initial conditions that were, at least in principle, determinable with precision. It was a world in which chance played no part, in which all the pieces came together like cogs in a cosmic machine. And this image of a simple, uniform, mechanical universe not only shaped the development of science, it also spilled over into many other fields. Indeed, so powerful is its continuing influence that much of social science, and especially economics, remains under its spell. In these words, Alvin Toffler very succinctly summarizes the kind of world that these modern scientists pictured and conceived of. But some of the other broader implications of this physicalist understanding of the world are as follows. Firstly, it led to the breakdown of the holistic conception of nature in which man was considered to be an integral part of. Secondly, it implied that the qualitative characteristics of reality are trivial and irrelevant, and that it is only the quantitative features of matter that were important. Thirdly, it implied that individuals exist and that collections are fictitious and merely the sum of its parts. More importantly, it implied that there was no higher purpose to life except a survival of the fittest, and lastly, that ethics is a subjective domain with no claim to universality. And one can clearly see how each of these implications have fed into the assumptions and conception of modern economics that was referred to earlier. In the remaining time that I have, let us very briefly look at the foundations of Islam and how they relate or compare to that of modern science. The key tenet and irreducible precept of Islam is the oneness of God known as Tawheed. And it is this Tawheed or the oneness of God that is manifest in all of His creation at the micro, meso, and macro levels. And this implies that there are deep interconnections within and between the levels, forming vast networks of relationships at both the visible and the hidden realms of existence. Clearly, under such a conception, The entire universe is organically rather than mechanically conceived. Next, all of life has a definite purpose, not merely one of survival, but rather to recognize and to realize the oneness of God in the world that we create and the world that we establish. And lastly, that the destinies of ourselves and those around us are not deterministic, but a world in which free choice plays a key role in determining our outcomes. And if you unpack this Tawheedi framework or episteme, you'll find that four key elements also emerge from within it to form the ontological framework of Islam. And these are organicism as opposed to mechanism from the modernist framework. We have holism as opposed to atomism. We have free choice as opposed to determinism. And we have the worlds of the visible and hidden as opposed to the quantitative and visible world of modern science alone. And when we juxtapose the one against the other, we can see how vastly different the ontological framework of Islam and Tawheed is against the ontological framework of modern science. And the upshot of this is to demonstrate that any conception of Islamic science and Islamic economics in particular, therefore has to be predicated upon its own foundation and not merely superimposed upon the foundation of a framework that is incongruent and inconsistent with the Islamic episteme. And therefore, Islamic economists have to develop their science on the foundations of Tawheed rather than expecting to develop their discipline on the foundations of physicalism. Thank you very much.